This week on the Communicators, former Federal Communications Commission member Michael Copps on legislation to reform the FCC, consolidation of telecommunications firms, and the state of the media.
Well, it's been about 4 months since Michael Copps is no longer a member of the Federal Communications Commission, but he joins us here on the Communicators to talk about some of the issues that the FCC is currently facing. Michael Copps, welcome back to the Communicators.
Delighted to be here. Thanks for having me on.
And Eliza Krigman is our guest reporter. She's technology reporter with Politico. Commissioner Copps, if we could start with a bill that's currently working its way through the House, and that's FCC Reform. What do you think about that? Is it necessary?
Well, there's always room for an agency to reform. I like to think that I contributed some to reform when I was there. When I was acting chairman, we opened up the agency, made it a lot more transparent, a lot more participatory. The biggest reform I would like to see would be to empower commissioners to talk to one another as a group so that we could sit around a table like this and talk about some of the momentous issues that are carving the destiny of our future and our kids' future. We're prohibited from doing that by something called Government of the Sunshine Law, which was something passed way back in Watergate days that really hobbles the FCC. Nobody else operates like that. Members of Congress talk to one another. Cardinals in the church talk to one another. The members of the Supreme Court who are meeting this week on health care reform will be talking to each other. We can't talk to each other except one-on-one. And you have 5 people who are selected because they have various and diverse capacities. There's a lot of collegiality there. People get along well. But I think we would have avoided some of the tensions and problems that occasionally come up had we been able to talk together. So I like to see Congress do that. There are other reforms we could do. I think it'd be nice if we put out, for example, an annual report. I think it would be nice if we, given the status of where everything is, I think it would be nice to consolidate reports. So that kind of process reform is good. Eviscerating the commission, disemboweling the commission, and trying to keep it from serving the public interest is not process reform and substantive destruction. It's not good for consumers. It's not good for an independent agency. This is an agency that the United States should be proud of. Not every country has this, where the White House or the minister, the head of government, or the minister calls up and tells you what to do. We have an independent agency with 17 or 1,800 real experts, and are given some independence so that we can serve consumers and help to get the best communications and advanced telecommunications and media out to all of our people. We ought to be proud in building that up. You have to be careful that you don't, number one, get captured by the folks that you're regulating, and number two, you have to be careful to keep that independence and let us do our job. If you're going to say you can't attach conditions to a merger, that's not what the law says. That's a big change in the law, but it's a big change in the way the FCC operates too. And I think that some of the stipulations or proposals that are in that reform legislation would end up not expediting the business of the FCC, but slowing the business. I think we'd be in court more. I think we'd be in court earlier. I think we'd have to hire more people just to keep up with all of these requirements. My friend Susan Crawford wrote a good article about this in Wired recently. I'm expressing my own opinions. I'm not saying she thinks all of this, but I think we need to tread very, very carefully before we just go and slam bang and change the FCC.
Well, right after you retired, December 31st, 2011, there was an article that came out in Telecom AM, and it was dated January 10th, 2012. And the headline of it was "Smooth Sailing for Corporate Deals Seen with Copps Exit from FCC." I'm sure you've seen this article. What was your reputation, and are you fearful that with you not there as the voice, that there may be some deal making done?
Well, there was a lot of deal making done while I was there. Much of it was done over my objections. I didn't vote against all consolidation and mergers, but I voted against my share of them. I think consolidation has been the bane of the industry. I think it has taken efficiency out of the industry where it's supposed to inculcate. I think it has put the industry in debt to such an extent as when you talk about media and all the consolidation we've had there, you finance these huge deals, and how do you pay for them? Well, let's see. Oh, why don't we cut back the newsroom, or shutter the newsroom, or fire a few reporters, and all that. So yes, some would have you believe the age of consolidation is over with. That's not so. There's just one merger after another, and as soon as the FCC approves one, competitor comes through the door and says, well, you not let that fellow get bigger, so now we have to get bigger too. And you either have the outright kind of mergers, or deals like Verizon and the cable industry. In media, we had NBCU within the last year. You've got Scripps buying up stations, Sinclair buying up stations, Cumulus, Citadel buying up stations. And as the economy starts to get better, I think you're going to see more rather than less consolidation. At some point, we've got to learn to say no to some of these deals while we still have any hope of developing competition and any hope of restoring our media, and any hope of really making sure we get advanced telecommunications out to every single American.
Eliza Krigman.
So let me ask a follow-up question to that. In order to say no more, do we need process reform at the FCC, or do the commissioners need to have a stronger backbone on this?
Well, you really have to have, first of all, you have to have an appreciation of what's at stake in the public interest, and what are the goals of the Communications Act, and how you interpret them. But I think the Telecommunications Act of 1996 envisioned all sorts of competition that never saw the light of day, both in telecom and in media. So there are different mentalities, different arguments about it. Maybe some people don't think it's as destructive as I think it's been, but I think we need to have more commissioners there who are skeptical of all of this consolidation, who can look around and see the damage that it's done and see that it's not serving consumers. This is supposed to be a consumer protection agency, and I want it to be a consumer protection agency. And when it is a consumer protection agency, it's a darn good agency for the people of the country.
So let's talk about today's high-profile transaction pending before the FCC, the cable company sale of spectrum to Verizon Wireless. Do you have any concerns about it, and why specifically, if you do?
Well, I do. I don't know. Call it what you will. Some will say it's conspiracy and restraint of trade. Some will say cabal. Some will say cartel. Some will say collusion. All these C's. The C I'm worried about is consumer, and the other C is competition, and I'm skeptical of it. Obviously I'm not at the commission. I haven't looked at all of it, but from my distance, it looks like Verizon will get a pretty good deal on control in the wireless market, and the cable folks will be reigning supreme when it comes to a wire line, and then they'll be working amongst themselves with joint marketing agreements. That doesn't strike me as the way to foster competition and bring down prices. And prices are going up. There's just a story a week or so ago that the cable bill again has outstripped the pace of inflation. So we need to reverse that. We need to give competition an edge. If you're going to say no to competition, then how can you be thinking about gutting the agency that designed some rules of the road for this industry to operate? You have to have that. You have to have that oversight, especially if you're not going to have competition. So the people are talking about all this process reform and eviscerating the FCC that could, wrongly done, open the worst of both worlds, where you don't have any competition and you don't have any public interest oversight. It's not what was intended. At least I certainly hope it's not what was intended.
Right. It's no secret that you don't think there's enough competition in the communications market. Where should the government intervene to incent more competition? And what is your philosophy of that?
Well, I was at the commission for 10 years. We had lots of opportunities. One of them is to say, the big one is to say no to some of these deals. The other one is conduct your public interest oversight. There's lots of proceedings that have been pending for a long time that need to be. Special access is one of them. I think we really need to address special access in the telecommunications market because I think that has disserved the competition and added to the cost of consumers. So I think taking those issues up and We have a broadband strategy now that's good for the country. I was lamenting the absence of that for 8 years when, in the previous administration, when the reigning thought was just let the market get all of this out to the American people. It took us a long time to realize the market wasn't going to do that. We started off, when I came to the commission, I guess, as number 2 maybe or 3 in the world in broadband penetration. Goodness knows where we are now, 15, 20, 24. I don't know exactly, but I know it's not where your country and my country ought to be. So there is room for positive government policy. It's the private sector that drives development. It's the private sector that really fuels it. But always in our history, we've had some vision of where we're going and some encouragement, some policy by the government. And if ever we needed that, it's right now when we have this imposing and opportunity-creating infrastructure of the 21st century with broadband and the internet and all that can just open so many doors of opportunity to so many people. And we've got to step up to the plate and say, look, this stuff is really important. This is going to determine if our kids get jobs, if our country is going to ever regain its international competitiveness, and that's a tough one too. There's no problem that this country faces that doesn't have as part of its resolution something doing with broadband. So there's a huge public interest in that. And the Commission, I think, has to be bold in stepping up to the plate and recognizing that the times have changed and players change and gatekeepers change over the course of years. You've got to be steady in your dedication to the principle, though, of competition, and then you just go from there.
Well, Michael Copps, let's look at the Verizon cable company spectrum issue just a little differently, and that's as a spectrum issue. Has the FCC been remiss in making sure that spectrum is available so that perhaps this type of marketing deal would not need to be done?
Well, we need to understand where we are with spectrum. We need to have a better inventory of spectrum than we have. We also, I think, should have something closer to a use it or lose it policy. You know, why we get into these big things where we're going to let them sell this, or you don't sell spectrum, you sell licenses and things like that, although the companies would say, my spectrum, my spectrum, my spectrum. It's our spectrum, it's yours and mine, and people who are watching this. So there's a lot of spectrum out there today at this hour. I don't think anybody in the United States has really very much of a clue of exactly how much spectrum is lying fallow. But I'll bet you it's a whole bunch of it that could fuel a whole bunch of devices and empower a whole lot of technology. So we need to get a handle on that. But we'll hope that the spectrum auctions can clear up some new spectrum, although we can talk more about that later. I think it has some potential. I think it has some problems attached to it too that we need to be very careful. And then there's encouraging new technologies, smart technologies and all that, and spectrum sharing. So there's lots that we can do. I think it's high on the agenda of the Commission, and I think Chairman Janikowski and colleagues down there are very aware of the fact that it's a huge, huge challenge. We are just using up more and more spectrum, so we have to find better uses. There is no silver bullet. There's no one approach that's going to solve it, that we have to be moving on all of these fronts.
Well, you mentioned the spectrum auctions. Do you foresee them taking place in the near future? And if they took place, let's say today, how long before that spectrum would be online?
Well, I think it can take a while, and they're not, you say the near future, they're not going to take place right away. I hope the Commission will do everything it can to expedite them. But again, we don't want to see that as just some kind of silver bullet solution. I'm not comfortable in saying, let's go in and take a whole bunch of spectrum from big consolidated media and turn it over to big consolidated telecommunications. That does not necessarily translate into automatic enhancement of the public interest. So we have to be careful. Again, we have to be careful about, is there going to be some opportunity for competition here? Are we going to have designated entity rules for these auctions? I haven't heard too many people talking about that yet, but we need to think about that. The last time we had an auction, we waited until too late in the AWS auction years ago to even get around to crafting those rules, so we didn't end up with the very best rules, but that's important. But there's always so many unintended consequences when you do something that's this broad and this important. What's the impact going to be on public radio, public television? I'm really concerned about that. Public television is doing a good job with multicast and using 3 or 4 or 5 programming streams to do really good programming. And all of a sudden, if they're going to be decreasing in number, their stations are going to be thrown together. Does that mean we're going to have less programming? I'm worried about small diversity stations in big markets who might be really fighting to hold on, and now they can sell their license and turn their spectrum in. That's not necessarily good in those particular markets. So there are lots of different ramifications that tell me to be careful how we trod, and we're not going to get 500 megahertz through these auctions. I don't know what we're going to get, but it'll be far short of that. So I hope they work. I think we need to expedite them and do them as quickly as possible. It takes a while to get auction rules and designated entity rules and all that. But meanwhile, we can't let all of these other avenues of encouraging technology and all that slow down.
You're watching C-SPAN's Communicators program. Our guest, former FCC Commissioner Michael Kopp, served on the commission for 10 years. Also joining us is Eliza Krigman of Politico.
So you mentioned getting to 500 megahertz, the president's goal for repurposing spectrum for mobile broadband. We're not going to get that alone through the auctions and other ways through freeing up government spectrum. But it's been very hard to do that, particularly with the 1755 band. Broadband guru Blair Levin suggests that we should just quit our efforts there and focus on sharing spectrum and other ways to reach that goal. Do you think that the government needs to be pressured more to free up their spectrum, and how should we accomplish that?
Yes, I think again we have to get a real good fix on what it's being used for, and some of those uses are pretty heavy uses, and you have to have sometimes it lying fallow and to be available to be used in emergency situations. But we all know how government works and how government bureaucracy works, and we love our national security apparatus, but they're not shy in holding on to the resources that they need or asking for resources, and there's no question in my mind, but I'm sure there are sizable swaths of spectrum that could be freed up, but it really takes some intestinal fortitude to make that happen, and to make that happen, people in the highest up positions of power are going to have to say, this is going to happen.
Do we need legislation mandating spectrum inventory? I know there's some out there floating in Congress, or is this something the FCC can simply take up on its own?
Well, we can do it, and we have done it to some extent with regard to the broadband, but not and you don't have to have an inventory of every little square foot in the United States of America, but you can do an inventory, I think, based on some sophisticated modeling and tools like that can give you a pretty good feel of where we are, and maybe legislation would help, but I think the FCC can do something like that any time it decides and wants to do it. Take some resources.
What's the hesitation?
Well, I don't know what the hesitation is. It will take some time. It will take some resources. There are probably monetary constraints attached to it. It's not a wonderful time for anybody's budget, including the Federal Communications Commission. We're pushed so many ways, pulled so many ways. When I got there, I think we had maybe close to 2,000 employees. Now it's down in the 1700s, and just look how the world of telecom and media has changed, and all the new problems and challenges and the technologies that you have to understand and train your employees for, and for the commissioners to understand. So it's there's a lot going on, and that would take some resources to do that.
Well, as someone who has obviously followed telecommunications issues for a long time and probably continues to, Commissioner Kopp, what do you think about the cybersecurity bills that are currently working their way through Congress? Well,
I think we're a day late and a dollar short on cyber security. It's a huge problem. I think the capacities of other countries to do us damage through cybersecurity are already obvious to most citizens, and they're very serious. So I think we really have to see this as this would be one of the major fronts of international confrontation here at any time from now forward. So we need to be prepared for that. It has to be a priority. That's obviously not simply an FCC function. I mean, that goes to every agency.
Eliza Krigman.
Do we need to be concerned about the foreign countries that are investing in our national telecommunication efforts as part of the cybersecurity issue?
Well, I think you always do. I think that's why you have sections in the law that talk about foreign ownership. And if indeed this is as critically important and at the same time as vulnerable in infrastructure as it is, then I think you have to be careful who's owning that and who's operating it. Ownership always matters. That doesn't mean you never allow it, and certainly we have allowed lots of foreign ownership, and some of that is justified. But I think in this age of heightened national security challenges, we need to have a good conversation about that. Those stipulations were written long ago, before probably the word cybersecurity was even extant, so that's one of those issues that needs to be revisited, and it really needs to be prioritized. And I worry that, every agency seems to have a cybersecurity guru or a chief, but there's got to be somewhere, there's got to be a center of that and somebody really driving. I hope we're getting to that.
On a separate topic, we know you're a big advocate of the open internet. Those rules are being challenged in court this year. Do you think that the FCC is going to win in court?
Well, I certainly hope so. I am hesitant to predict the outcome of any court cases. We're all fixed to our TVs this week watching the healthcare reform. We've got some of the indecency cases up there with the FCC. I would hope so. As you probably know, I expressed some questions at the time about whether this was the best legal terrain, Title I, to make our case on. When we had Title II, I think just looking at in retrospect after these years, and we started debating this back in 2002 and started making these awful decisions about it's not telecommunications really, it's something else, so we'll put it over here where there's no oversight instead of here where generations of reformers had worked for years and generations to get some consumer protections. That was just the wrong way to go. So I think Title II has more legal clarity, but I am hopeful that we will get some deference on this and ability to move ahead, and if not, it would be my strong recommendation to repair to a Title II defense as soon as humanly possible if we get turned down.
Michael Copps, what do you think of the FCC's recent decision on LightSquared?
Well, I think it was very difficult. I was there for part of that, and I think the experts there, the Office of Engineering Technology, really dug in and did so without prejudice and really tried to understand the facts of the matter and was there going to be interference, and I would laud their performance. I mean, while both sides were up, of course, lobbying on the Hill, and the sky is falling on part of both of them. But I think a disinterested evaluation of it drove the FCC to its. I think it was the best decision they thought they could make.
What do you think about the fact that there's only been 3 commissioners since you left in December?
Well, I think there should be 5 commissioners there and talking to one another. It operates best when there's a full complement of people and a diversity of input and more advisors, more commissioners, and a better discussion. So it still has a quorum, and it's still doing business and casting votes and making decisions. And there are 3 very capable people there who seem to get along very, very well. They don't seem to; they do. I was part of it. So I think they're doing well, but I think they would be augmented by having 2 additional commissioners there, both of whom I know and both of whom I think will be outstanding members of the FCC.
Eliza Krigman.
If you could wave your wand to have the FCC accomplish one thing in the next 6 months, what would it be?
Get serious about media.
Okay, be more specific than that.
Well, without a news and information infrastructure that informs people about the world they live in, I don't see any of the problems facing this country being promptly or rightly resolved. And we have to be brutally candid about it, dumb down our democratic dialogue and our civic dialogue because of the consolidation that I mentioned earlier. We have sacrificed many journalists, and newsrooms and investigative journalism, I think, hangs by a life thread because of an FCC that has refused through the years to step up to the plate on its public interest oversight responsibilities on media. And this goes back to the 1980s with one or two brief exceptions. We used to have guidelines, for example, for broadcast licensees. All of that is gone now. I would bring some of those back. I would make them kind of news-centric and encourage the development of news and information. But in this, we have all of this wonderful possibility for an enhanced civic dialogue, not just traditional media, but new media and a town square of democracy that could be paved with broadband bricks. And the traditional media has stripped itself of its capacity to do its job, and the new media has not demonstrated that there's a model there to replace that. 90 to 95% of the news that you and I and everybody else gets every day, reads every day, even on the internet, comes from where? The newspaper newsroom and the broadcast television newsroom. It's just that there's so much less of it. And this is a serious challenge to our democracy. We've always found ways as a country to keep the people informed. You can go back to the days of Washington, Jefferson, and Madison, the people who wrote the First Amendment, and freedom of the press and all that, but they said, we've got a new young republic here, it's a new experiment, can it survive? We've got to get the news out. So what they do? They build post roads and they subsidize newspapers of every stripe. Right, left, whatever terms you wanted to use back then, very opinionated. But just get it out there and keep the people informed, and that's your premise, and that's the premise of self-government. An informed electorate will make proper decisions. That was kind of the idea behind broadcast, the bargain broadcasters made for free use of the spectrum. They'd serve the public interest, convenience, and necessity. And we've got to get back to that kind of thinking. And it's not, we don't have time to sit around and say, well, the new media and the internet will solve all this someday. I don't think we can stand another 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years of a diminution of media and journalism and news and information.
And finally, Michael Copps, what have you been doing for the last 4 months?
Well, if I look at my calendar, it's almost as busy as I was at the FCC. I've been trying to make some talks in various areas, keep my issues alive. The one thing I want to do is keep the issues that I was passionate about at the FCC alive, and primarily that's media, news, and information, also broadband, minority ownership, and female ownership, and all of those things are very important. So I haven't made any decisions about, if I'm going to find a little home somewhere or do this from my home or what, but I will be speaking out, join the Common Cause Board of Governors recently. I'll probably be joining some more boards, and hopefully you will be hearing from me, and hopefully enough that you'll say one day, gee, let's have him back. He's still doing some interesting things.
Michael Copps, former FCC Commissioner, has been our guest on the Communicators this week, along with Eliza Krigman of Politico. Thank you both.
Thanks for having me.